My name is Mary Astor. In the summer of 1936, my diary knocked Hitler off the front page of every newspaper in America. I want to be precise about what was in that diary, because the version that ran on those front pages was almost entirely invented, and the real document was burned by court order before most people had a chance to ask what it actually said. Here is what I know for certain. I kept a diary. I wrote in it honestly, the way a person writes when they believe no one else will ever read the pages. I wrote about my marriage and what was wrong with it. I wrote about falling in love with a playwright in New York. I wrote in purple ink. My husband found those pages, understood their value as a weapon, and used them to extort my signature on a divorce settlement that gave him full custody of our 4-year-old daughter, half my house, and control of my finances. He stood over my sickbed to do it. I was sick with the flu and alone, and I signed. For 15 months after that, every time we disagreed about anything, he threatened to release the diary to the press. In the summer of 1936, I decided I had had enough. The trial that followed was the most covered story in America that summer. Bigger than Hitler's rearmament of Germany, bigger than the Spanish Civil War, bigger than anything happening anywhere in the world that had actual consequences for actual people. Vendors sold hot dogs and ice cream outside the courthouse. Reporters invented passages from a document they had never seen and printed them as fact on front pages across the country. Every studio head in Hollywood assembled in a single room to tell me it would be better for the industry and for me if I dropped the case. I thanked them for their concern. I walked out. I went directly to my lawyer's office. I said we were going to trial. What happened next is what I am here to tell you, in my own words, without the invented scorecard, without the fabricated excerpts, without the purple ink turned into something it never was. Just the account. Mine. I kept a diary. That is the whole origin of this story. Not an affair, not a scandal, not the moral collapse of Hollywood that the press declared it to be in the summer of 1936. I kept a diary, the way that writers keep diaries, the way that anyone with an interior life and the habit of language keeps a diary. To think, to process, to put the chaotic texture of a life into sentences that make it legible. I wrote in purple ink, which was a detail the newspapers seized on immediately, because purple ink sounds more decadent than blue ink, and decadence was the story they had already decided to tell. They called it the Purple Diary. The name stuck. The actual diary was 2 blue ledgers, 200 pages each, containing the honest observations of a woman who had been performing a version of herself for public consumption since she was 14 years old, and needed somewhere to be entirely real. My former husband found those ledgers in 1933. He found them where I kept them, in a bedroom drawer, which is not a hidden location, which tells you something about how little I anticipated what he would do with what he read. He read everything. He found his own unflattering portrait. I had written that I felt sorry for him, that I had made him marry me, that our life was a series of explosions. He found the section about the playwright I had fallen in love with in New York. And then he understood that he had found the instrument he needed. The newspapers said the diary contained a scorecard of my lovers. Mary Astor was an unofficial scorekeeper in Hollywood's tournaments of love, the Chicago Daily Tribune reported. I could not sue every newspaper. I beat my fists on my lawyer's desk and said, "There wasn't any box score, and I never called the damn thing Dear Diary." Nobody printed that. The blackmail started immediately. He stood by my bed when I had the flu, weak, sick, unable to fight, and threatened to release the diary to every newspaper in America, unless I signed a divorce settlement giving him full custody of our daughter, half my house, and control of my finances. I signed. I was sick and alone, and I signed. The settlement gave me 6 supervised visits with my daughter per year. 6 visits per year with my own 4-year-old daughter. And for 15 months after that, every time we disagreed about anything, he threatened again. Finally, in the summer of 1936, I made a decision that everyone in Hollywood told me was professional suicide. I decided to fight back. On the last day of filming a picture in the summer of 1936, I was called into the producer's office on the lot. I had been expecting a note about the final scene. What I found instead was every major studio head in Hollywood sitting in a row waiting for me. The producer, Louis B. Mayer, Jack Warner, Harry Cohn, Irving Thalberg, the men who between them controlled every film made in America. They had assembled in one room on a working afternoon to deliver a single message: drop the custody case. They were not concerned about my daughter. I want to be precise about that because the meeting was framed in the language of concern. Concern for the industry, concern for my career, concern for the reputations of certain prominent people who might be mentioned in the diary's contents. The actual concern was the second item on that list. The diary, they believed, contained names of actors, writers, directors, men whose careers and marriages and carefully constructed public images would not survive the specific kind of scrutiny that a public trial in 1936 would bring. They needed the diary sealed. The easiest way to seal it was to make sure there was no trial. The easiest way to ensure no trial was to make sure I dropped the case. It would be better for the movie industry, they told me, and for you. I had been performing for powerful men since I was 14 years old. My father had taken control of my career and my earnings before I was old enough to understand what a career was. My husband had stood over my sickbed and extorted my signature. And now the most powerful men in Hollywood were sitting in a row telling me what would be better for me, in a room I had not been invited to, about a fight they had not been asked to weigh in on. I looked at them. I thanked them for their concern, and I walked out of that room and went directly to my lawyer's office and told him we were going to trial. The newspapers the next morning said the studio heads had tried to intervene. "Film moguls failed to stop Astor trial," read the headline. I cut it out and kept it. The trial opened on July 29, 1936, and the crowds outside the courthouse were so large that vendors set up stands selling hot dogs and ice cream on the sidewalk. Hot dogs and ice cream outside a custody hearing. That is the specific quality of what my diary had become by the summer of 1936. Not a private document, not a piece of evidence, not the record of a woman's interior life, but a public entertainment. The press had been printing excerpts for weeks, most of them fabricated by journalists who had never seen the actual pages. "Bare excerpts of Mary Astor's Lavender Diary," ran the headline in the Chicago Daily Tribune on August 11th. The excerpts were not bare. They were invented. And because I could not sue every newspaper simultaneously, the invented version became the version that people believed. My husband's lawyer stood up in that courtroom and described the diary as a sexual scorecard in which I had rated every prominent man in Hollywood on his performance in my bed. This was not true. What was true was that I had written honestly about a love affair that had mattered to me, with a playwright who was brilliant and married and completely clear about both of those facts from the beginning of our involvement. What was also true was that the diary my husband possessed had been mutilated, pages torn out, passages fabricated, the document altered to serve the case he was trying to make. My lawyer argued that it should be inadmissible as a tampered document. The judge agreed. The diary was declared inadmissible because my husband had removed every page that mentioned himself unfavorably and replaced them with content he had manufactured. The press did not cover the inadmissibility with the same enthusiasm they had covered the excerpts. The fabricated scorecard remained on front pages across the country for weeks after the judge had ruled it inadmissible. A reporter had invented passages wholesale and printed them as fact. I could not sue her. I could not stop the circulation of a version of myself constructed from material that had never existed. What I could do was sit in that courtroom every day, composed and present and completely unintimidated, and let the jury of public opinion watch a woman refuse to be destroyed by a lie. That, it turned out, was enough. I want to tell you what I actually wrote, because 40 years of fabrication has buried the real document under so many invented versions that the truth requires excavation. The diary was honest. That is the entirety of what made it dangerous. Not that it was scandalous, not that it contained a scorecard, not that it named names in the way the press claimed. It was honest in the way that private writing is honest when the writer believes no one else will ever read it. I wrote about my marriage with the clarity of someone who had stopped pretending. I don't love Franklin anymore. I am unhappy and bored with him. I wrote about my daughter with the specific tenderness of a mother who understood, even as she was failing at the marriage, that the child was the irreducible thing. I wrote about New York and the playwright and what it felt like to be genuinely seen by someone for the first time in years. The section about the playwright was real. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not apologize for it. I had fallen in love. I had written about falling in love in a private document that was never intended to be read by anyone except me. I wrote that it was beautiful and glorious. I wrote that I hoped it was my last love and that I couldn't top it with anything in my experience. These were the words of a woman having the most significant emotional experience of her adult life, written in the privacy of her own diary, in purple ink, in a bedroom drawer. When my husband found those words, he understood immediately that they were more valuable to him as a weapon than as information. He did not feel betrayed. He felt armed. What the diary did not contain was the rest of what the newspapers claimed it contained. There was no box score. There was no ranking of prominent men. There was no systematic catalog of Hollywood's sexual underground. The journalist who invented those passages knew they would sell papers. She was correct. The invented version outsold the truth by a considerable margin, which is a ratio that has remained remarkably consistent in the relationship between the press and women's private lives across the century that followed. I beat my fists on my lawyer's desk. I said the things I had said. Nobody printed them. The invented version ran for weeks on front pages that had pushed Hitler and Franco off to make room for a fabricated diary that a judge had already ruled inadmissible. Let me tell you about the work, because the trial has consumed so much of the telling of my life that the work tends to disappear underneath it. I had been acting since I was 14 years old. My father, a controlling man who saw my face and my talent as a business opportunity, before I was old enough to understand what a business was, took charge of my career and my earnings, and managed both with the specific efficiency of someone who has no conflict of interest because he has made himself the only interest. I had no bank account of my own until I was an adult. The money I earned went to my father. The roles I played were selected by men. The image I projected was constructed by men. By the time I arrived in Hollywood in the late silent era, I had been performing for other people's requirements for so long that the discipline of it was simply the texture of my working life. The sets in those years were extraordinary. I worked with directors who understood the camera as a precise instrument and understood that a face, the right face, in the right light, at the right moment, could do things that no script could fully contain. I had that kind of face, and I knew it, and I used it with the same professional exactness that a carpenter uses a good tool. The costumes, the lighting, the particular choreography of a well-constructed scene. I loved all of it without sentimentality, the way a craftsman loves the materials of a craft. And I was good at it. Genuinely, technically, consistently good at it across silent pictures and sound pictures and comedy and drama and the specific genre that would become my most famous association. The picture about a bird made of black enamel and greed, in which I played a woman whose motives were entirely unclear and whose presence made every scene more dangerous. The work survived everything. That is what I want you to understand about the summer of 1936 and all its hot dogs and ice cream and fabricated diaries. The work survived it. Not because Hollywood was merciful, and not because the public was forgiving in the way that word usually implies, but because a producer looked at the rushes from the picture I was making when the trial began and refused to fire me despite a morals clause in my contract that would have given him every legal right to do so. The reviews were extraordinary. The public came. The studio heads who had sat in that row and told me it would be better for me to disappear discovered that the audience had a different opinion about what would be better. I was not finished. I had not even reached the work I would be remembered for. My daughter was 4 years old when her father stole my diary. She was 4 years old, and she became, in the specific calculus of her father's strategy, the instrument through which he intended to control me permanently. Not because he loved her with a love that required her presence. The evidence of his actual relationship with her was available in the courtroom, where I testified that he shook her so hard her teeth rattled, that he bit her lips, that the child who lived in his custody was frightened of him in ways that a 4-year-old should not be frightened of her father. He wanted custody of my daughter because custody of my daughter was custody of me. That is the mechanism. It is not complicated. It is the oldest available mechanism, and in 1936 it worked with remarkable efficiency because the law treated a mother's morality as a relevant variable in custody determinations, while treating a father's morality as largely beside the point. The trial, at its core, was about her. The diary was the weapon. The fabricated scorecard was the ammunition. The studio heads assembled in a producer's office were the context. But the actual stakes were a 4-year-old child, and which parent she would live with, and whether the woman who had been blackmailed into surrendering custody while sick and alone would be allowed to correct that under the scrutiny of a public trial. I fought for her in a courtroom where vendors sold ice cream outside, and reporters printed things about her mother that were not true. I sat in that courtroom every day, and I did not collapse, and I did not perform remorse for things I had not done, and I did not give the press the broken woman they were expecting. On August 13th, 1936, the judge awarded me custody of my daughter for 9 months of every year. Her father would have her for 3 months, the summer, the school vacation, the portion of the year when her absence from me would hurt least. The judge then ordered the diary sealed and placed in a depository. Later, with my permission, it was incinerated. The document that had pushed Hitler off the front pages, that had assembled every studio head in Hollywood in a single room, that had generated weeks of fabricated excerpts and invented scorecards and hot dogs and ice cream on courthouse steps, that document was burned. I had asked for it to be burned, because the real diary had never been the problem. The problem had always been the version that other people invented from it. And that version, I had already discovered, was perfectly capable of surviving without the original. The career that followed the trial was, by any objective measure, better than the career that preceded it. That is the fact that tends to surprise people when I tell it, because the narrative of the summer of 1936 is a narrative of destruction. The diary, the trial, the fabricated excerpts, the studio heads in a row, and destruction narratives are supposed to end in ruins. Mine did not. The producer refused to fire me. The picture I had been filming during the trial opened to extraordinary reviews. The public came in numbers that told the studios something they had not expected to learn from a woman whose private diary had been on the front pages for 6 weeks. That audiences did not require their actresses to be saints. They required them to be interesting. I had become, in the summer of 1936, the most interesting woman in Hollywood. The studio system, which runs on interest, adjusted accordingly. The Oscar came 5 years later. A picture about a concert pianist, a role I played with everything the trial had taught me about what it costs to be a woman who refuses to be managed. The Academy gave me Best Supporting Actress in 1942, which meant that in the 6 years between the courthouse and the ceremony, I had gone from a woman the studio heads had assembled to silence to a woman holding an Academy Award. I did not mention the studio heads in my acceptance remarks. Some things are better communicated by simply standing there holding the award. And then came the picture about the black bird, the falcon, the greed, the shifting loyalties. I played a woman whose motives were genuinely unclear, whose surface charm concealed calculation, whose every scene left the audience uncertain whether to trust her. It was the most purely enjoyable work of my career. I understood that woman completely. I had been surrounded by versions of her for 30 years. The later years brought other things. Alcoholism. I will say it plainly, because I said it plainly in my autobiography, and plainly is the only way I know how to say difficult things. A period of institutionalization, a return, more pictures, television, a stage career, 5 novels. My autobiography was a bestseller, which meant that the woman the studio heads had tried to silence in a producer's office in the summer of 1936 eventually told her own story to a public large enough to constitute something like vindication. I found that what I needed was simpler than vindication. I needed to finish the work. I needed to raise my daughter. I needed to write the books. Those things I did. The studio heads who sat in that row are footnotes now. I made 109 pictures. Some of them are very good. I want to end where I began, because the diary is where everything began, and the diary is what this story is actually about. Not the affair, not the trial, not the studio heads, not the invented scorecard. The diary. 2 blue ledgers in purple ink, 200 pages each, kept in a bedroom drawer by a woman who had been performing for other people's requirements since she was 14 years old and needed one place in her life that belonged entirely to herself. That is what a diary is. That is what every diary is. It is the place where the performed version of yourself is not required, where you are permitted to be uncertain and petty and brilliant and wrong and genuinely, specifically, privately alive in a way that the public version of your life does not accommodate. My husband understood that the diary's power was not in what it actually said. Its power was in the gap between what it actually said and what people could be made to believe it said. He did not need the real document. He needed the idea of the document, the suggestion that somewhere in those purple ink pages was something devastating enough to destroy me if released. A reporter invented passages and printed them. Another reporter printed those passages without attribution. Newspapers across the country ran the invented version for weeks after a judge had ruled the actual document inadmissible as a forgery. The fabricated diary was more powerful than the real one because the fabricated diary could be anything anyone needed it to be. The real diary was just a woman's honest account of her own life. In 1936, that was already sufficiently dangerous without any embellishment. What I want you to understand is that the mechanism my husband used against me was not unusual and was not new. A private document, real or invented, used to establish that a woman is unfit for the life she has claimed for herself. Unfit to be a mother, unfit to work, unfit for the public's respect. The document does not need to be accurate. It does not even need to exist. It needs only to be credible enough, in circulation long enough, to do the damage before the truth arrives. The truth about my diary arrived eventually. The judge ruled. The fabricated passages were identified. The document was incinerated. My daughter came home. And 6, today, when people mention my name, the first thing they reach for is the purple diary, the invented version, the scorecard that never existed, the document whose actual contents were burned 80 years ago. The mechanism outlasted the evidence. It across does. So now you have the real diary, not the purple diary that the newspapers invented, not the scorecard, not the ranking of Hollywood men, not the fabricated excerpts that a reporter printed as fact while the judge was ruling the actual document inadmissible as a forgery. The real one. 2 blue ledgers in purple ink containing the honest observations of a woman who had been performing since she was 14 and needed one place that was entirely hers. That document was burned. What I'm giving you now is what it actually said, translated into the only language that matters, the language of what actually happened and what it actually cost. I want to ask you something before you go. In 1936, every major studio head in Hollywood assembled in one room to tell a woman to drop her custody case because the trial might inconvenience them. They did not ask her permission to assemble. They did not consider that the question of who raised her daughter was not their business. They simply gathered, the most powerful men in the most powerful industry in America, and told her what would be better. For the industry, for her. The 2 items were presented in that order, which tells you everything about the actual priority. I thanked them and walked out. That was the correct response. It is always the correct response. But I want you to notice how much energy and organization it required to produce that response. How many years of being performed for, extorted, fabricated about, and assembled against it takes before a woman learns to walk out of a room full of powerful men and go directly to her lawyer's office and say, "We are going to trial." The diary was incinerated. My daughter came home. The Oscar came 5 years later. I made 109 pictures, wrote 5 novels, published an autobiography that became a bestseller. The woman they assembled to silence eventually told her own story to a public large enough to constitute an answer, if not a verdict. The studio heads who sat in that row are footnotes now. The reporter who invented the passages that ran on front pages across America is a footnote. The judge who burned the diary is a footnote. What is not a footnote is the mechanism, the private document used as a weapon, the fabricated version that outlasted the real one, the powerful men who assembled without being asked because a woman's private life was considered their professional concern. That mechanism is not a footnote. It did not get burned with the diary. It is still running. Share this. Talk about it. And the next time someone tells you they have information about a woman that would change how you think about her, ask to see the original document. Ask who had access to it. Ask what they changed.